6. Liberty and property. Biblical faith is land-oriented, and both the Old and New Testaments pronounce a beatitude upon the meek before God. They shall inherit the earth. Psalm 37:9, Matthew 5:5. In illustration, Naboth's religious loyalty to family and land is to be noted. Side by side with this land-based nature of biblical religion is also the pilgrimage note. The Feast of Tabernacles and the dwelling in booths as a reminder of Israel's wilderness journey emphasized their status as pilgrims towards tomorrow, God's great promise. Thus, family and land were rooted in yesterday, but unlike other religions, biblical faith was not past-bound. Its central and taproot was in the future, and in terms of this, man was and is a pilgrim. And he claims title to the land because all creation is to become his inheritance. His nature and destiny are of God. He holds the land from God and in terms of God's law and promises. Some of the implications of this were noted by Bishop Sheen in his testimony before a congressional committee. Quote, "There are several reasons why there is no place for God in communism. One is because of its concept of freedom. Suppose I correlate the problem of religion and the problem of freedom in answering your question, and let me begin with freedom and then go to religion. A man is free on the inside because he has a soul that he can call his own. Wherever you have the spirit, you have freedom. A pencil has no freedom. Ice has no freedom to be warm. Fire has no freedom to be cold. You begin to have freedom only when you have something immaterial or spiritual. Now, freedom must have some external guarantee of itself. The external guarantee of human freedom is property. A man is free on the inside because he can call his soul his own. He is free on the outside because he can call something he has his own. Therefore, private property is the economic guarantee of human freedom. Suppose now you concoct a system in which you want to possess man totally. On what conditions can you erect a totalitarian system so that man belongs to you completely? 1. You have got to deny spirit. 2. You have got to deny property. This is why the existence of God and private property are both denied simultaneously by communism. If a man has no soul, he cannot allege that he has any relationships with anyone outside of the state. If he has no property, he is dependent upon the state even for his physical existence. Therefore, the denial of God and the denial of freedom are both conditions of slavery." End quote. We have seen that the colonial concepts of government and of liberty were developments of feudalism, again, a land-based system. It is not surprising that the watchword of the Sons of Liberty was, quote, "liberty and property," end quote. The two were common causes in English history. The long struggle for protection of property and person from the absolute claims of the king had a mixed victory in 1688. Trial by jury and other liberties were gained, but also parliamentary absolutism. The legal protection of property had a long legal history in England. Thus, the law requiring the death penalty for every man, woman or child who stole property to the value of 5 shillings had a 200-year history. The unfairness of the penalty has been recognised, but the law, commonly ascribed to the 18th century only, also made clear the strong sense of property in England. The significance of property was discussed in Cromwell's army during the Putney debates in 1647. Ayrton spoke of, quote, "the most original, the most fundamental civil constitution of this kingdom, and which is, above all, that constitution by which I have any property." End quote. Ayrton declared further in a discussion of suffrage, "A 40-shilling freehold gave suffrage, whereas £100 a year leasehold did not." Quote, "The people's falling into a government is for the preservation of property. What weight there lies in this, since there is a falling into government, and government is to preserve property, Therefore, this cannot be against property. The objection does not lie in that, the making of the representation more equal, but the introduction of men into an equality of interest in this government, who have no property in this kingdom, or who have no local permanent interest in it. I do not mean that I would have it restrained to that proportion that now obtains, but to restrain it still to men who have a local, a permanent interest in the kingdom, who have such an interest that they may live upon it as free men, and who have such an interest as is fixed upon a place and is not the same equally everywhere." End quote. Ayrton argued against soldiers who asked why they should have no vote, having fought for their country. Ayrton did not place a class restriction upon voting. A wealthy man without locally owned property, holding only leases, had no right to vote. For Ayrton, as for untold others, property and liberty were concepts related to localism. Property and power had to be local, and trustworthy wealth was landed wealth. Liberty rested on this relationship. Responsibility and liberty began at home. This faith crossed the Atlantic with the colonists and flourished there. The county, today the neglected unit, became, under the developing colonial and early federal governments, the basic American unit of government. For some generations in United States history, the primary importance of the local and county units governed political life. Presidential elections could not compete in importance with state politics, and local and sectional interests governed federal elections, so that Federalist, Republican, American Democratic, and Whig elections were often heavily influenced by non-federal factors. After Washington, no president, at least through Lincoln, could be said to be a nationally popular figure, because the federal government did not sufficiently dominate or control the republic to give such stature to a president. It is a mistake to read present evaluations and the heat of party newspapers of the times into the popular mind of that day. The triumph of Jefferson, thus, was not a popular movement. John Adams may indeed have had a slightly stronger following, but rather the result of political organization and the able manipulation of local and sectional interests. The Jeffersonians represented an intelligent and able political group rather than a popular movement. The strategic importance of localism, politically and economically, is by no means gone. Land and personal property taxes, as well as basic criminal law, are still in county hands, making it the main bulwark against the power of Washington, D.C. and the states. Any restoration or essential development of American constitutionalism must involve a revival of localism. It is significant that the mounting statist movement has launched an attack on the integrity of county power. Basic to any renewal of localism are three things. 1. The religious recognition that the basic government is self-government. There is no freedom for men who will not be responsible. This is, of course, the personal covenant of grace, the responsibility of the Christian man before God. 2. Free and responsible men see as their most important obligations those nearest home. If they fail in the immediate responsibility, they cannot be capable of meeting a distant one. Hence, with responsibility, there is major concern with local government, be it personal, family, societal, township, or county. The old Bostonian attitude that an office in Boston or Harvard is more important than an office in Washington is a faint trace of this belief. 3. A restoration of religious faith in the significance of real property and the relationship of ownership and power is necessary. It should be noted that much of what is written off as land speculation among the Founding Fathers involved also a religious sense concerning land and an association of land with true wealth. As has been noted of George Washington, quote, "A typical instance of his craving for land is an episode that occurred after the war. While travelling in upstate New York with Governor George Clinton, he saw beautiful woodland and, though he had no cash, was already burdened with debts for land purchases and was unlikely ever to see that land again, he arranged to borrow $6,000 from Clinton and bought it on the spot. End quote. During the Constitutional Convention and after, many spoke of the necessity of restricting suffrage to men of property. On this basis, Marxists have attacked the Constitution and the Founding Fathers as men of a narrow and class perspective. Consequently, some have portrayed subsequent history as the progressive liberalisation of ostensibly harsh laws which kept most people from voting. In answer to these positions, it must be observed, first of all, that the fear of the propertyless man's vote was often very different from what the modern radical or leftist assumes it to have been. The full statement of Madison during the convention debates needs to be examined. Quote, Mr. Madison, the right of suffrage is certainly one of the fundamental articles of republican government and ought not to be left to be regulated by the legislature. A gradual abridgment of this right has been the mode in which aristocracies have been built on the ruins of popular forms. Whether the constitutional qualification ought to be a freehold would with him depend much on the probable reception such a change would meet with in states where the right was now exercised by every description of people. In several of the states, a freehold was now the qualification. Viewing the subject in its merits alone, the freeholders of the country would be the safest depositories of republican liberty. In future times, a great majority of the people will not only be without landed, but any other sort of property. These will either combine under the influence of their common situation, in which case the rights of property and the public liberty will not be secure in their hands, or, which is more probable, they will become the tools of opulence and ambition, in which case there will be equal danger on another side. The example of England has been misconceived by Colonel Mason. A very small proportion of the representatives are these chosen by freeholders. The greatest part are chosen by the cities and boroughs, in many of which the qualification of suffrage is as low as it is in any one of the US, and it was in the boroughs and cities rather than the counties that bribery most prevailed and the influence of the Crown on elections was most dangerously exerted. End quote. Madison recognised the possibility that propertyless men would unite against the rest of society, but he did not consider it likely. Rather, he felt it, quote, more probable, end quote, that such men would, quote, become the tools of opulence and ambition, end quote, so that a new, quote-unquote, aristocracy would rule, using the masses as its tools. The results would be an oligarchy ruling in the name of the people. Governor Morris, in the same debate, affirmed a similar position. Quote, it was the thing, not the same, to which he was opposed, and one of his principal objections to the Constitution as it now is before us is that it threatens this country with an aristocracy. The aristocracy will grow out of the House of Representatives, give the votes to people who have no property, and they will sell them to the rich who will be able to buy them. We should not confine our attention to the present moment. The time is not distant when this country will abound with mechanics and manufacturers who will receive their bread from their employers. Will such men be the secure and faithful guardians of liberty? Will they be the impregnable barrier against aristocracy? He is as little duped by the association of the words, quote, taxation and representation, end quote. The man who does not give his vote freely is not represented. It is the man who dictates the vote. Children do not vote. Why? Because they want prudence? Because they have no will of their own? The ignorant and the dependent can be as little trusted with the public interest. He did not conceive the difficulty of defining, quote, freeholders, end quote, to be insuperable. Still less that the restriction could be unpopular. 9/10 of the people are at present freeholders, and these will certainly be pleased with it. as do merchants, etc., if they have wealth and value the rights they can acquire it. If not, they don't deserve it." End quote. Notice again that Morris feared the propertyless men, if granted the suffrage, would usher in the rule of an aristocracy. The poor would be controlled in their voting by the great and the rich, their masters. That Madison and Morris were right, recent events have substantiated. The presidency, if not held by men of great wealth, is increasingly controlled by them, and the cabinet, especially under Kennedy, has represented an amazing concentration of wealth. Through the manipulation of labour votes, powerful financial and industrial interests, the modern oligarchy, or the effectual power in Washington, which has become hostile to a free market economy but favourable to oligarchy. The other members of the Constitutional Convention did not foresee the future problems feared by Morris and Madison. James Wilson called attention to the widespread suffrage, 9/10 according to Morris's statement, in the states. To restrict suffrage by stricter federal regulations would lead to problems. Mason commented, quote, 8 or 9 states have extended the right of suffrage beyond the freeholders. What will the people there say if they should be disenfranchised? End quote. Dickinson pointed out that since, quote, the great mass of our citizens is composed at this time of freeholders, end quote, no departure from tradition would be involved, and no quote-unquote innovation. Rutledge feared that a constitutional restriction would be a divisive measure. But Morris insisted, quote, unless you establish a qualification of property, we shall have an aristocracy, end quote. This, then, was the fear. Those disagreeing with Madison and Morris did not favour an aristocracy or oligarchy. They simply did not foresee the danger. And since almost all Americans were already freeholders, the question was to them an academic one. Second, as has already been indicated, propertyless men were, in all the states, at that time very few, and in some areas a rarity. A detailed study of suffrage in Massachusetts has confirmed this. Virtually all Massachusetts men could meet the property requirement. An aristocracy and a lower class were scarcely in existence. Quote, in Massachusetts, therefore, we find one of the unique revolutions in world history, a revolution to preserve a social order rather than to change it, end quote. As Burstyn has remarked, quote, the most obvious peculiarity of our American Revolution is that, in the modern European sense of the word, it was hardly a revolution at all. The daughters of the American Revolution, who have been understandably sensitive on this subject, have always insisted in their literature that the American Revolution was no revolution, but merely a colonial rebellion. The more I have looked into the subject, the more convinced I have become of the wisdom of their naivete. End quote. Some years later, Tocqueville reported, with reference to property and suffrage, quote, in America, those complaints against property in general, which are so frequent in Europe, are never heard, because in America there are no paupers, and as everyone has property of his own to defend, everyone recognizes the principle upon which he holds it. In the United States, except slaves, servants, and paupers in the receipt of relief from the townships, there is no class of persons who do not exercise the elective franchise and who do not contribute indirectly to make the laws. End quote. The people of the United States were then, and for some time thereafter, freeholders, and the correlation of property and power was taken for granted. Third, as Brown's study among others indicates, the property requirement was higher in local than in state elections, with none on the federal level. Neither the Revolution nor the Federal Union led to a liberalisation of the property requirement. The Northwest Ordinance, reenacted by the new government, established thus before and after the Constitution a 50-acre freehold qualification. North Carolina alone had an equally high requirement. Fourth, the basic premise of colonial legislation on suffrage had been the necessity of demonstrable Christian character. Quote, It is obvious from this description of colonial suffrage legislation that it was designed to confine the vote to desirable elements of the population. It was drafted in the conviction that efficiency, honesty, and harmony in government rested, in the last analysis, upon a salutary degree of homogeneity of interests, opinions, and fundamental loyalties, religious, ethnic, and class. Confining the vote in colony elections to those who were free, white, 21 native-born Protestant males who were the owners of property, especially real property, appeared to be the best guarantee of the stability of the Commonwealth. The drafters of colonial suffrage legislation, to whatever extent they attempted to formulate ideas, seem to have thought that undue disparities of interest, opinion, and loyalty among electors would weaken and distract government. It is in the light of their principles, rather than those of the present times, that the suffrage laws of colonial times can be understood." End quote. It should be noted that by 1776 the colonies had a greater degree of homogeneity than ever before. The South at this time, as well as Pennsylvania and other areas, had been, first, subject to great waves of immigration, and second, to an extensive religious revival. Englishmen and Scotch-Irish and German yeomanry had entered southern states in such numbers that the old settlers were far outnumbered. Thus, during the Revolutionary period, the white population of North Carolina was tripled, and that of South Carolina quadrupled. The period from 1760 on, seen by Chard Powers Smith and others as a time of religious decline from the perspective of New England, was elsewhere, and especially in the South, a time of religious revival. The intensely held faith of these people was usually reformed, and thus not unlike New England Puritanism in many respects. It could be reasonably argued that, for some time to come, the mainspring of American Puritanism moved southward, and that there the conception of the Holy Commonwealth prospered. Unitarianism subsequently developed in New England, even as Trinitarian orthodoxy triumphed elsewhere. A Roman Catholic scholar, commenting on the Calvinist Jedediah Morse and his battle against the Illuminati in New England, has observed, quote, "The Illuminati, qua organization, did not have the effect on American politics attributed to it, qua crystallization of the zeitgeist. They changed the trend of continental Freemasonry, animated the French Revolution, and via France came to America, where they changed theocratic New England into a secularist country, almost anti-clerical in its public policy." End quote. This decline, however, came later. At the time of the Revolution, and much later, New England and the rest of the country shared a common faith and perspective. Fifth, irrespective of the issue of suffrage, property was seen as the necessary basis of the economic aspect of society. Jefferson's agrarianism was in part based on his strong adherence to a freehold society rather than a propertyless and money-based urban society. It was recognized that property meant inequality, since property and the freedom to acquire property leads to diverse conditions for men, but it was held liberty and equality could not coexist. The right to liberty ensured inequality, in that under freedom some men would excel. Both Federalists and Republicans were in agreement on this point later and earlier. At the Constitutional Convention, June 26, 1787, Hamilton agreed with Madison's comments on this question, declaring, quote, "It was certainly true that nothing like an equality of property existed, that an inequality would exist as long as liberty existed, and that it would unavoidably result from that very liberty itself." End quote. Sixth, the extension of suffrage rights did not coincide with the rise of democratic thought in the modern sense, nor with Jacksonianism. The, quote, "farmer's age," end quote, led to something very much like the agrarian republic Jefferson desired, and was thus a time of property ownership, that is, real property. Freehold tenure lagged in New York but prevailed generally elsewhere. The old freehold requirements were easily met, and a 50-acre requirement was no problem. The relaxation of this and similar requirements came first out of a sense of confidence in the freehold basis of the United States, and second from a belief in the limitation of powers and a distrust of privilege. Thus, James Fenimore Cooper, by no means a champion of the left of his day, declared in 1838, quote, "When property rules, it rules alone, but when the poor are admitted to have a voice in government, the rich are never excluded. Such is the nature of man, that all exclusive power is uniformly directed to exclusive purposes. Property always carries with it a portion of political influence, and it is unwise and even dangerous to strengthen this influence by adding to it constitutional privileges, the result always being to make the strong stronger and the weak weaker." End quote. Cooper's premise was a distrust of any government which represented a particular group, rich or poor, propertied or non-propertied, on a national level. On the local level, Cooper believed in a more restricted suffrage in terms of local interests. This was, of course, the basic pattern in many areas. It represented a faith in the centrality of the local unit. Quote, "Universal suffrage," end quote, Cooper held, was a foolish term, in that first, women were excluded, as were all males under age. Furthermore, paupers, criminals, vagabonds, and aliens were also excluded. Moreover, quote, "The governments of towns and villages, for instance, are almost entirely directed to the regulation of property and to the control of local interests. In such governments, universal suffrage is clearly misplaced, for several grave and obvious reasons, a few of which shall be mentioned. The laws which control the great and predominant interests, or those which give a complexion to society, emanate from the states, which may well enough possess a wide political base. But towns and villages regulating property chiefly, there is a peculiar propriety in excluding those from the suffrage who have no immediate local interests in them." End quote. The principle here is obvious. The basis of county government is its power to tax property, real property in particular. To break down this liberty of the local property owner to govern himself by introducing the control of propertyless voters over his property is to destroy the foundations of society in the American and in the Christian sense. In some states, to this day, the right in counties to vote on tax and bond issues is limited to property owners. On state and federal levels, since the basis of taxation and government is citizenship or residence, not property, it was deemed only just that each citizen of good character, meeting the various requirements of mature and responsible citizenship, should have the right of suffrage. The relationship of property and liberty is thus critical at the county level, and the centrality of county politics in early American history is unduly neglected. Its neglect has substantially contributed to the decline of the American system. Attempts to eliminate the county as obsolete and redundant are thus attempts to destroy America as a republic and as a federal system. Indirect attempts have also been prevalent. Two may be cited in passing. First, federal subsidies have undermined the independence and authority of county governments. Second, state-sponsored property tax exemptions for war veterans have produced two generations of men who are unmindful of the burdens placed upon property and the erosion of property rights. The continuing vitality of the country, however, must not be discounted. Neglected by voters who are ignorant of its importance, it is indeed often heavily weighted with incompetent and dishonest men. Nonetheless, it is an area where thousands of dedicated men are waging a major battle for the American system. Significantly, too, the county is the last area where religious tests for teachers and civil officers have maintained their vitality, whether openly or tacitly. Suffrage restrictions also have had their major stand, both for good and evil, primarily in terms of county politics. Finally, the stress on property was secondarily economic and primarily ethical. The man of property had at least the character to provide for himself and his family and to develop an inheritance. Madison was opposed to a landed qualification for office in that, quote, landed possessions were no certain evidence of real wealth. Many enjoyed them to a great extent who were more in debt than they were worth. Some other criterion than the mere possession of land should be devised, end quote, as a property test. Debt and irresponsible management did not meet the moral test Madison had in mind with respect to property, and debt made ownership null. The principle, as Felix Morley has observed in an unpublished lecture, was qualitative, not quantitative. The New England, quote, select men, end quote, were more than elected men. They were intended to be select men. The basis of suffrage and representation was responsible character. Hence, no recipient of government subsidy or charity could vote. The original idea of the poll tax was to establish responsibility. The responsible taxpayer was made the voter. The first attack on local responsibility came early in the 19th century with the explosion of the possibilities of a clause in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, with reference to the Electoral College. Quote, each state shall appoint, in such manner as a legislator thereof may direct, a number of electors, equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress, but no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. End quote. While not dictating to the states, the Constitution, by paralleling the electors to the congressional structure, at least suggested a similar means of election to the states. At first, some states chose their electors by congressional districts, with 2 at large to represent the senators, or by legislative act or other means. Gradually, state politicians realized the power inherent in control of the total electors by means of a statewide vote for the entire list. The state majority thereby overruled the congressional district and gave the electoral vote to the urban political boss. Quote, in 1836, the general ticket system was used in every state but South Carolina, which continued to elect by legislature through 1860. End quote. 3 exceptions have occurred since then. Quote, they were Florida in 1868 and Colorado in 1876, in which the electors were by the legislature, and Michigan in 1892, when the district system with 2 electors at large was used. End quote. The real problem, then, with the Electoral College is not in its structure. Quote, the real culprit is the use of the general ticket by every state. End quote. Legislation to correct this situation has been proposed by Carl E. Munt, U.S. Senator, South Dakota. A basic premise of this proposal is the restoration of control to the congressional district in the election of president. It is in spirit a part of the long-standing insistence on local responsibility which is basic to the American belief in liberty and property.